We would like to send out a special thanks to our sponsor, Wink, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $20 credit, plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. So please visit trywink.com/cold. That's trywinc.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the show. November 13th, 1981. Stinson Beach, California. 44-year-old John Paul Russell and 34-year-old Bob Dozier emerged from the Pacific Ocean, claiming that their yacht, the Freedom II, sank after a large freighter crashed into them. John's 30-year-old wife, Suzanne Russell, and their 20-year-old friend, Kristen Tomlin, were also on the boat and presumed drowned. However, when no trace of the Freedom II can be found, investigators suspect the whole thing was an elaborate scam orchestrated by the two men, and that Suzanne Russell may have been in on it and faked her own death. After hiding out for over a decade, Russell and Dozier are both captured and serve time in prison for fraud, but Kristen Tomlin is never found, and her fate remains a mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering one of the more unusual missing persons cases I've ever done, the 1981 disappearance of Kristen Tomlin. It was just over a year ago when we released our first episode involving a missing boat, the Patinella, and I thought it was about time we released another one. It involves a yacht called the Freedom II, which supposedly disappeared off the Pacific coast near San Francisco, but there is a lot more to this story. It seems likely that the Freedom II never went down at all, and the whole thing was an elaborate attempt at insurance fraud. The case was profiled on Unsolved Mysteries and is one of those dreaded missing segments which was not uploaded to Amazon Prime last year, so I was extra motivated to cover it since I consider it to be one of the more underrated stories featured on the show. However, I also consider it to be one of their more frustrating stories because it almost seems like the real victim here, Kristen Tomlin, was treated as an afterthought. At the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired, the two men behind this scheme, John Paul Russell and Bob Dozier, were wanted on fraud charges. Both were eventually captured and served time in prison on these charges, so technically the mystery is partially solved, but we still don't know what happened to Kristen Tomlin. Not only that, but John Paul Russell's wife was also supposedly on the Freedom II when it went down, and she was never found either, but evidence suggests she was a willing participant in this scam all along. It's a very bizarre story which has still not attained full closure, and even though it was billed as a fraud case when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, it should now be considered a missing persons case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Kristen Tomlin. Our story begins in California in 1981. During the early morning hours of November 13th, two men came climbing out of the Pacific Ocean onto Stinson Beach, located over 20 miles north of San Francisco. One of them, 44-year-old John Paul Russell, had a sprained ankle, so he remained on the beach while the other man, 34-year-old Bob Dozier, went to summon help. When help arrived, both men claimed they had been in a terrible boating accident and were taken to the hospital for treatment. The boat in question was a 51-foot yacht Russell owned named the Freedom II. The story was that they had set sail from Sausalito the previous day in order to take a trip to Tahiti with two women, John's 30-year-old wife Suzanne Russell, and a 20-year-old friend named Kristen Tomlin. According to the two men, while they were stopped in the water dealing with generator problems, a large unidentified freighter crashed into the Freedom II and destroyed its rudder. The freighter did not stop to offer assistance to the damaged vessel, and just took off. The Freedom II then dropped anchor and started taking on water. They attempted to call for help by sending out distress signals over the radio and firing off some flares. However, a violent storm soon hit the area, consisting of 80 to 100 mile-per-hour winds, which ripped the anchor chain and propelled the Freedom II into some sharp rocks, causing the boat to get torn in half and sink. Everyone involved managed to climb onto a rubber raft, but strong waves caused the raft to capsize. The two women became separated from the men and were apparently swept away to be lost at sea. Russell and Dozier both swam for shore and eventually managed to reach Stinson Beach to call for help. However, right from the outset, there was a lot of skepticism about their story. For starters, when they were treated at the hospital, neither Russell nor Dozier exhibited low body temperatures or showed any signs of hypothermia, which seemed to go against the idea that they had been swimming in cold, 55-degree ocean water for several hours. Even though both men had claimed to have sent off distress signals over the radio after the crash, there was no record of them, even though a Coast Guard observation center was within radio range and should have picked them up. And while they claimed to have fired off flares, a Coast Guard monitoring boat was only 3 miles away from the location where the accident allegedly occurred, and they did not recall seeing any flares that night. In spite of this, the Coast Guard began an extensive search of the area surrounding Stinson Beach in order to look for the two missing women who were on the Freedom II. But incredibly, after Russell received treatment for his sprained ankle, he checked himself out of the hospital, and both he and Dozier immediately left town and flew to Las Vegas. The Coast Guard found it incredibly suspicious that neither man seemed to show any concern about the missing women, and did not even bother to stay in the area to monitor the progress of the search. They also failed to comply with a California law which required them to report all fatal boating accidents to the state. Things then got incredibly bizarre when Russell phoned the Coast Guard the day after he left town to inform them that there had been a mistake in his original story. He now said that there had actually been 3 women on the Freedom II when it sank, not 2. The third woman was named Cherie Ann Dozier, who happened to be Bob Dozier's wife. Russell claimed they had neglected to mention her because they were in shock and disoriented at the time they were rescued. He then stated that any further questions they had would be answered by their attorney. Well, it wasn't long before the Coast Guard started to believe that there had been no boating accident at all. After searching the area for several days, they failed to uncover any trace of the 2, or make that 3, missing women, and there was no sign of any wreckage for the Freedom II. An infrared photography team was brought in to fly over the area and found no evidence that a 51-foot yacht had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. However, some small pieces of wreckage from a boat did start washing up on Stinson Beach. One of them was a nameplate which included the letters O and M and the Roman numerals 2. But after it was compared to a photograph of the stern of the Freedom II, it appeared that the lettering on the nameplate was different than the lettering in the photo. Upon closer examination, all the pieces of wreckage found on the beach were non-vital fragments of the boat which did not belong to the main hull, and some of them even appeared to have hammer marks on them. It was beginning to look like these pieces might have been removed intentionally and tossed into the ocean to give off the false impression of a boating accident. Even more holes started emerging in Russell and Dozier's story. They had originally told the Coast Guard there was no radar on the Freedom II, but other people who were familiar with the boat claimed that it did have radar. Well, the two men claimed that 80 to 100 mile-per-hour winds propelled their boat against some sharp rocks. The National Weather Service reported that the winds were no stronger than 40 miles per hour that night. The story about a large freighter crashing into the Freedom II did not seem to check out, as the Coast Guard had no records of any freighters in that area during that particular time period. Furthermore, the location where this alleged incident supposedly took place was not even on the normal route from Sausalito to Tahiti. One Coast Guard investigator was quoted as saying, "I've never been to Tahiti, but I don't think you go out of the Golden Gate and turn right." And what about Russell's bizarre decision to change the number of women who were on board the Freedom 2 from 2 to 3? Well, this only added to the confusion. Investigators interviewed Rick Wood, the co-owner of a marina where the Freedom 2 had rented a berth. He was acquainted with the group, but claimed that the only two women he knew were Kristen Tomlin and Cherie Ann Dozier, and that he never met anyone named Suzanne Russell. In fact, Wood interacted with the group before the Freedom 2 set sail on November 12th, but said he only saw two women board the boat, Kristen Tomlin and Cherie Ann Dozier. If that wasn't enough, a man going by the name John Paul Farrell soon contacted the sheriff's office in Virginia City, Nevada, to report the incident with the Freedom 2, and said that there had been 4 people on the boat. He also named Kristen Tomlin and Cherie Ann Dozier, and claimed that Cherie Ann was his daughter. Well, it didn't take long to figure out that John Paul Farrell was actually John Paul Russell. On November 18th, investigators traveled to Las Vegas to interview John Paul Russell and Bob Dozier in the presence of their attorney. They changed their story again, and now claimed that only 2 women had been aboard the Freedom 2, Kristen Tomlin and Suzanne Russell. They finally confirmed that Suzanne Russell and Cherie Ann Dozier were actually the same person, and that she often used both names for quote-unquote business reasons. After this interview, Dozier and Russell broke off all contact with the authorities and would drop out of sight for a long time. Are you confused yet? Well, here's an explanation for this whole mess, as these folks had a pretty strange backstory. Yes, Suzanne Russell was John Paul Russell's wife, as the couple originally got married in 1971. John later became friends and business partners with Bob Dozier, and by the end of the decade, the two men decided they wanted to open a saloon together in Virginia City, Nevada. The problem was that John was a convicted felon, and there was a law in place to prevent people with criminal records from obtaining a liquor license, which is something you need when you want to run a saloon. So John came up with a weird scheme to get around this. He convinced Suzanne to marry Bob Dozier. Using the fake name Cherie Ann Farrell, Suzanne got married to Bob and officially became Cherie Ann Dozier. The Doziers then obtained a liquor license and opened up an establishment called the Stage Shop Saloon, but because John's wife was legally married to Bob, this allowed him to maintain some control of the saloon. So in summary, this woman was married to 2 different men and going under 2 different names, Suzanne Russell and Cherie Ann Dozier, which is bigamy and totally illegal, but it sounds like it was totally par for the course for this group. In case that hasn't made your head completely explode yet, marriage records also listed Cherie Ann Farrell's father as John Paul Farrell, which is the same name John Paul Russell used when he phoned the police to report his quote-unquote daughter missing. Anyway, Kristen Tomlin became friends with this group after she got a job as a barmaid at the saloon, which they wound up selling in August of 1981. She reportedly started dating Bob Dozier, though whether or not she knew he was legally married to another man's wife is unclear. A deeper check into this group's background also revealed that John and Suzanne Russell had both been the target of an FBI probe. Years earlier, John owned a boating firm in which clients would loan him money to purchase boats and then resell them at a profit. Well, the problem is that he never actually reimbursed his clients any of the money which they had loaned him, and he eventually disappeared. So if the Freedom 2 was not actually involved in a boating accident, what did happen to it? The boat was officially registered under Bob Dozier's name at a Phoenix address, but it turned out Dozier did not actually live at the address provided. The records showed that it had been purchased from a man in Bay County, Florida named Michael Hayes. Well, guess what? Michael Hayes turned out to be an alias Dozier had used. An identification number for the Freedom 2 was listed, which was matched to a boat building company in New Jersey, but they claimed they only made 20-foot powerboats, not 50-foot yachts, so the ID number was obviously false. Well, investigators started piecing this confusing puzzle together from a key piece of evidence. The day after Russell and Dozier emerged from the ocean, a life preserver with Freedom 2 written on it was washed ashore on Stinson Beach. The Coast Guard noticed outlines of letters on the opposite side of the life preserver, which looked like they had been sun-bleached off. Tests were eventually performed which revealed that the letters spelled out the word Monokai, and the Monokai happened to be the name of another yacht which had been reported lost at sea years earlier. It was starting to become apparent that the saga of the Freedom II was part of a scam operation, which involved staging the disappearances of boats in order to collect insurance money. The investigation eventually led to a man named Doug Reinertson, who happened to be the chief investigator of the Las Vegas Public Defender's Office. In June of 1981, Reinertson had reported his yacht, named the Inspiration, stolen from the Wilmington Yacht Center, and wound up collecting $110,000 in insurance money. Well, photographs of the Inspiration showed that it bore a striking resemblance to the Freedom II. It turned out that Reinertson was a former employee of John Paul Russell's fraudulent boating firm, and that he'd also collected an insurance payout on another yacht which was lost in 1979. Shortly before the Inspiration was reported stolen, two men matching the descriptions of John Paul Russell and Bob Dozier had been seen boarding the boat at the Wilmington Yacht Center while carrying several suitcases. It was theorized that they had taken the Inspiration elsewhere, repainted it, and then had the boat re-registered as the Freedom II. The whole thing was an elaborate scam to collect insurance money, and they were probably attempting to do the exact same thing again with the Freedom II when it supposedly sank 5 months later, but the authorities saw right through the scheme this time. For falsely reporting his boat stolen, Doug Reinertson was charged with felony insurance fraud and sent to prison, while warrants were issued for the arrests of Russell and Dozier. But there was also another possible angle. A week after the disappearance of the Freedom II, pieces of plastic bags and drug paraphernalia, which included syringes, paper packages, and vials, washed ashore on Stinson Beach. These items had words like snow seals and white lady on them, which seemed to imply they were ordinarily used to transport cocaine, though no traces of cocaine were actually found. The area in which these items were found had been the site of at least 2 prior drug busts, but it's possible they had no connection to the Freedom II. However, one possible theory is that Russell and Dozier had been using the Freedom II to transport cocaine until they decided to stage a phony boating accident. They'd tell their associates that all the drugs had sunk to the bottom of the ocean, when in actuality, Russell and Dozier would just keep the cocaine and sell it themselves at a huge profit. Whatever the motive for staging the sinking of the Freedom II, there was still a troubling unanswered question. What actually happened to the 2 women, Kristen Tomlin and Suzanne Russell, aka Sheree Ann Dozier? Well, given her prior history of being involved with her husband's illegal activities, the authorities suspected that Suzanne was in on the whole thing. Since she was known for being a skilled sailor, it was theorized that Suzanne could have sailed the Freedom II to another location and hidden it somewhere while the 2 men called for help at Stinson Beach and shared their phony boating accident story. In the ensuing years, there would be unconfirmed sightings of Suzanne and the Freedom II, and it was discovered that over the course of their lives, John, Bob, and Suzanne had used a combined total of 21 known aliases. But the truly baffling aspect of this story was the involvement of Kristen Tomlin, as she completely vanished off the face of the earth following the incident. Was Kristen also in on the scheme before she went into hiding? Or was she an innocent victim who was used as a pawn and murdered in order to lend credence to the idea that she was killed in a boating accident? Well, since no evidence ever surfaced to suggest that Kristen was still alive, her family feared the second scenario had occurred. Anyway, years passed without any sign of the 4 people who were aboard the Freedom II, so the story was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries on November 9th, 1988. The show immediately received a viewer tip from Canada, which added a surprise spin to the story. A couple from Whitby, Ontario named Bill and Betty Rochert claimed that 2 men and a woman matching the descriptions of John Paul Russell, Suzanne Russell, and Bob Dozier had attempted to purchase a boat from them in 1982 under the names John Smith, Anne Christine Smith, and Bob Johnson. But after making a down payment of 10% of the purchase price, the trio just took off and stole the boat without paying the Rocherts the rest of the money they were owed. Bill and Betty proceeded to do an extensive 6-month search for their boat and tracked it down to a port in Fort Pierce, Florida. The Rocherts took this matter to the Canadian courts and filed suit against Anne Christine Smith. Neither the Smiths nor Bob Johnson bothered to show up to the proceedings, so the court ordered them to return the boat to the Rocherts and issued a judgment of over $47,800. Of course, since the trio just completely disappeared and dropped out of sight, Bill and Betty never saw any of that money. Needless to say, it took the Rocherts by complete surprise when they tuned into Unsolved Mysteries years later and saw photos of the three people who had attempted to steal their boat. The most intriguing revelation from this development is that it seemed to confirm that Suzanne Russell was still alive 1 year after the incident with the Freedom 2. Over the next few years, the case would be reran on Unsolved Mysteries a couple of times, and in April of 1991, a viewer tip finally led to the capture of Bob Dozier. The tipster had provided a phone number in Hawaii which was registered to Suzanne Russell, but while Suzanne herself was never found, it led authorities to Dozier. He was brought to Los Angeles to stand trial, where he pleaded guilty to grand theft and served a 6-month jail sentence. In June of 1993, John Paul Russell was finally arrested by the FBI at a construction site in Monroe, Oregon. He had been working as a roof installer under the name John Paul Farrell, and once again, his capture was made possible by a viewer tip after the segment about the Freedom 2 was reran on Unsolved Mysteries. Russell was charged with theft and insurance fraud, but unfortunately, I cannot find any information about how much time he actually served in prison. But given that Dozier only received 6 months, I'm guessing that Russell probably served a light sentence before he was released. I have no idea what happened to Russell or Dozier after they served their time, or if they're even still alive today. Even though Suzanne Russell was suspected of being complicit in their criminal activities, she was never tracked down or officially confirmed to be alive. But most tragically, Kristen Tomlin was never found, and there was never enough evidence to implicate Russell and Dozier in her disappearance. Technically, we still don't know what actually happened to her, and she remains a missing person to this day. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I think it would be an ideal time to pour myself a glass of wine and propose a toast to our sponsor, Wink, who have always been such a great supporter of our podcast. Wink is targeting a new generation of wine drinkers who want to do away with the pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced, great wine. Wink custom tailors wines to the taste of the individual consumer and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus free shipping. When you visit Wink and take their 20-second palate profile quiz, you'll get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. The price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up with Wink, you are getting your first bottle for free. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and live in the U.S. a $20 credit plus free shipping on your first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. Your wine delivery will be branded Wink. Wink is the wine club associated with Wink. My only issue is that whenever I propose a toast to Wink, I have a hard time selecting which vintage to pour because there are so many to choose from. So let's see. Oh, here's a good one. A 2016 bottle of Porter and Plot, which showcases California's most exceptional wines like this dry-farmed Pinot Noir from the Sonoma coast. By focusing on small lot wines, Porter and Plot showcases the unique, nuanced individuality of California's most exceptional vineyards and appellations. For Pinot Noir, cool climate is key, and the Sonoma coast is well renowned as the perfect environment for this finicky grape to thrive. An excellent Pinot Noir is a winemaker's piece de resistance, the one style that can definitively prove a masterful level of skill and knowledge. The finished wine shows a great balance of fruit, neutral oak influence, and earthy flavors of tobacco, menthol, and white pepper. It's best served at room temperature and goes very well with poultry, pork, or fish, along with veggies. So to receive a $20 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine just like this one on your first order, go to trywink.com/cold. That's trywink.com/cold. trywinc.com/cold. So here's a toast to Wink. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the show. Well, it's safe to say that this story is one of the most unsatisfying updates in the history of Unsolved Mysteries. Yes, the segment technically served its purpose because two wanted fugitives who were on the run for fraud charges wound up being caught and sent to prison as a result of the show. But it drives me nuts that this brought no closure to the disappearance of Kristen Tomlin, who was almost treated like a complete afterthought. And of course, there's also a second missing woman, Suzanne Russell, who was likely a willing participant in this scheme, but never found either. So overall, I guess you could classify this as a half-solved mystery. Like I mentioned earlier, when this originally aired on Unsolved Mysteries back in 1988, it was labeled as a fraud story rather than a missing person story, and admittedly it is a very interesting fraud case, one of the more bizarre I've ever encountered, but it seems to overshadow the fact that an innocent young woman may have been murdered. And what's particularly sad is that there's virtually no information out there about Kristen Tomlin as a person. She doesn't even have her own profile page on missing persons websites like the Charlie Project or the Doe Network. I mean, I'm not even 100% sure of the correct spelling of her name, since some sources spell Kristen with an E, while others spell it with an I. The only thing I was able to uncover about her background were quotes in one of the articles I read from her father, Kenneth Tomlin, who was an engineer from Beaverton, Oregon. Kenneth was quoted as saying he, quote-unquote, smells several rats, and wanted to talk directly with the two survivors of the wreck. Dozier did call him up, and said they would talk to him about what happened to Kristen, but in person, not over the phone. But not surprisingly, they never contacted Kenneth again. All we know about Kristen is that she got a job at the Stage Shop Saloon in Virginia City, and became friends with Bob Dozier and the Russells. She apparently began dating Dozier, but I have no idea if she knew about that weird arrangement he'd made to marry Suzanne Russell. Apparently, the original airing of the Unsolved Mystery segment in 1988 contained a few interviews with Kristen's family, who claimed they hadn't heard from her since she went missing, but these interviews were edited out in syndication. And of course, since this segment was not uploaded to Amazon Prime, Kristen Tomlin has practically become a ghost, so I want to keep her memory alive in this episode. But before we talk about Kristen's disappearance, we have to break down this entire oddball scheme in order to understand the circumstances of how she went missing. From what I can tell, John Paul Russell and Bob Dozier were consummate scam artists whose operations often involved boats. After Russell ran a fraudulent boating firm in which he used his clients' money to purchase and resell boats without giving any of the money back, it sounds like he moved on to insurance fraud. It's apparent that the yacht known as the Freedom II had previously sailed under different names. We know that it used to be known as the Inspiration before it was quote-unquote stolen from its owner, Doug Reinertsen. After Reinertsen received an insurance payout, he likely split the money with Russell and Dozier while they repainted the Inspiration and renamed it the Freedom II. And years earlier, it sounds like this particular boat was known as the Monokai before they perpetuated the exact same scheme and renamed it the Inspiration. Rinse, repeat. I have no idea how many different names this boat went under during its history, but Russell and Dozier probably would have kept this scam going indefinitely if the authorities had not figured out that their story about the sinking of the Freedom II was a load of crap. But one detail which is often overlooked is that we technically still don't know what happened to the Freedom II. Yes, the authorities concluded that the boat didn't actually sink, but they never did find it. Once again, it was probably hidden somewhere to be repainted and given an entirely different name, and for all we know, it could still be out there somewhere. I think the main reason this particular scam failed is because Dozier and Russell just got way too ambitious. It's one thing to report a boat stolen, but fabricating a fictitious boating accident just isn't going to work unless there's enough evidence to support their story. They probably figured that breaking off a few pieces of the boat and tossing them into the ocean to wash ashore would be enough to convince everyone, but the Coast Guard saw right through it. And of course, Dozier and Russell didn't do themselves any favors by checking out of the hospital and immediately leaving town without even bothering to fake concern about the two missing women who were lost at sea. The most mind-boggling piece of stupidity from this whole episode is how the two men originally claimed there were two women aboard the Freedom II, but then changed their story and told the Coast Guard there were actually three. But as idiotic as this decision might seem, I think I have an idea why they did this. They originally said the two missing women were Suzanne Russell and Kristen Tomlin, but remember Rick Wood, the owner of the marina which housed the Freedom 2, who interacted with the group before they set sail on their ill-fated journey, he told authorities that he knew Kristen Tomlin and Cherie Ann Dozier, but never met anyone named Suzanne Russell. Well, I think that John Paul Russell realized he'd made a mistake when he gave Suzanne's name to the authorities because Rick Wood knew her as Cherie Ann Dozier. So to account for this, he changed his story and told the Coast Guard there were 3, not 2 women on the boat. Of course, this idea didn't work since Wood specifically stated that he had only seen 2 women boarding the Freedom 2, which is probably why the 2 men finally confessed that Suzanne Russell and Cherie Ann Dozier were the same person. I guess it's always been up for debate about whether the motive for this entire scam was insurance fraud or if it was something larger, like drug trafficking. I know that after finding drug paraphernalia on Stinson Beach, investigators started theorizing that Russell and Dozier were involved in cocaine trafficking and decided to fake the sinking of the boat so they could sell the cocaine themselves and keep all the money. But I don't really buy that. It doesn't look like they ever turned up any evidence that the 2 men were involved in drug trafficking, and I just don't see how a scam like that would have worked. If drug dealers are entrusting you with thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of their cocaine, and your boat happens to sink with all the drugs on board, I don't think they're just going to say, "Ah, well, not your fault, you tried." No, I'm pretty sure you would be responsible for paying them back all the money that cocaine was worth. Since other drug busts had taken place in the Stinson Beach area prior to the incident with the Freedom 2, I'm inclined to think that all the drug paraphernalia found there had nothing to do with this case. So what about Suzanne Russell? For a while, it was up for debate about whether she was complicit in this scheme, or if she might have been a victim too. But I think it's pretty obvious she was in on it. She seemed to be involved in her husband's previous scams, and was willing to commit bigamy and marry 2 different men for the purpose of obtaining a liquor license. That doesn't sound like someone who was adverse to this type of criminal activity. I can totally believe that she sailed the Freedom 2 to another location and hid the boat while the 2 men emerged from the Pacific Ocean onto Stinson Beach and fed the authorities their fake story. I think the biggest piece of evidence that Suzanne was complicit in this whole thing was the phone tip to Unsolved Mysteries from Bill and Betty Rochert, who claimed that John, Bob, and Suzanne attempted to swindle them out of their boat. Since these events occurred in 1982, this seems like concrete proof that Suzanne Russell was still alive after the incident with the Freedom 2. Now, given that 6 years had passed, I suppose there's a small chance that the Rocherts were mistaken when they saw the photos of John, Bob, and Suzanne on television and mixed them up with someone else, but I highly doubt that. What are the odds that a completely different trio who resembled these 3 people would be perpetuating another scam involving a boat? I mean, look at the aliases they were using. John Smith, Anne Christine Smith, and Bob Johnson. There's no way they weren't the Russells and Bob Dozier. But as far as anyone can tell, this is the last confirmed sighting of Suzanne Russell. Now, in 1991, the authorities were able to track down Dozier in Hawaii because a tipster had provided them with a phone number which was registered to Suzanne Russell. So she may have also been living in Hawaii at this point, but she technically wasn't wanted on any charges, so it looks like they never found her. Suzanne Russell's current whereabouts are still a mystery, but for all we know, she could have just died of natural causes while living somewhere under a fake name, and we just don't know about it. Regardless, it doesn't sound like Suzanne was a victim in this story, so I guess it's now time to explore the big unanswered question. What actually happened to Kristen Tomlin? Well, sadly, given how much time has passed, and the fact that Kristen has never resurfaced, I do not think she is still alive. But if she was murdered, it's a big mystery how she would have even gotten mixed up in something like this to begin with. Like I said earlier, we really don't know much about Kristen's background. Was she willingly complicit in this entire scheme involving the Freedom 2? Or was she just a naive young woman who got mixed up with the wrong people? We know that Dozier and the Russells were professional criminals, but Kristen was much younger than them, and as far as I know, she doesn't sound like the type of person who would have gotten involved with anything illegal. When I first watched the Unsolved Mystery segment, I wondered if perhaps Kristen never boarded the Freedom 2 to begin with. It almost seemed like Dozier and the Russells just took the boat out onto the ocean for a few minutes, broke some pieces off, and tossed them into the water, and then returned to Stinson Beach to call the authorities. However, I then read about the eyewitness account from Rick Wood, who saw Kristen on the Freedom 2 when it set sail from the marina that day. That seems to confirm that Kristen definitely went out onto the water, but unfortunately, I don't think she returned alive. She may not have suspected that anything was amiss. Remember, the original cover story was that the yacht was struck by a freighter while it was in the midst of sailing to Tahiti. It's not hard to imagine how the group might have lured Kristen onto that boat if they promised her a trip to Tahiti. But if that's what happened, the most disturbing thing about this story is that there doesn't seem to be any logical reason to kill Kristen to begin with. Yes, the Russells and Dozier were professional scam artists, but there didn't seem to be anything in their backgrounds to suggest they were murderers. They had perpetuated scams just like this before involving boats, but they didn't involve foul play. Couldn't they have just taken Suzanne out into the ocean, had her sail away, and then lie to the authorities and then claim she drowned? Or better yet, why not fake a boating accident without actually faking anyone's death? Why bother involving Kristen at all? Did they think that killing someone for real would make their boat accident look more believable? Well, it didn't seem to do them too much good since her body was never found. If you tell the Coast Guard your boat went down with no one aboard, then there might not be a very thorough investigation. But if you tell them that there's a missing person who was aboard that boat, then that means there's going to be a massive search effort and a greater risk of your cover story falling apart, which is exactly what happened. It's my guess that if Kristen was romantically involved with Dozier, she might have found out too much about the scams and other illegal activities the group was involved with. They then grew concerned that she had become a liability, so they felt they had to get rid of Kristen to prevent her from potentially sharing incriminating information with the authorities. So promising Kristen a trip to Tahiti and luring her out onto the ocean aboard the Freedom 2 was just a convenient way to orchestrate their latest insurance scam and tie up a loose end at the same time. If no one ever found her body, they could just say she drowned in the Pacific Ocean and would never be recovered. To prevent Kristen's body from washing ashore, I'm guessing they probably weighted her down or just disposed of her at a location which was outside the Coast Guard search area. If that's the case, then I doubt they'll ever find her. Whatever their motivation might have been for murdering Kristen, it sounds like it was a completely senseless crime. While the perpetrators did serve a little bit of time in prison for their fraudulent activities, they got to walk free again and continue living their lives since there was still no evidence of foul play. So in the end, this sounds like the story of a very elaborate fraud scheme which crossed the line into murder, but sadly, the victim was completely forgotten about and never received justice. After all this time, I'm not sure this case can ever be completely solved, and I have no idea what John Paul Russell, Suzanne Russell, and Bob Dozier are up to today, or if they're even still alive. But if you happen to have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Kristen Tomlin, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have 3 new donors this week, and they are Sherry, Abby, and Nancy, so thank you very much, guys. Need to provide another shout out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself and your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll approve your entry into the group as soon as possible. I also want to mention that I will be representing the Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is being held at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May 4th to the 6th, which is only about a month away from now. I met some of you fine folks at CrimeCon last year, and I'm really looking forward to meeting more of you folks again at this year's event. So if you still need to purchase tickets to CrimeCon, you can receive a 10% discount by using our podcast promo code. Just visit crimecon.com and get 10% off by entering the promo code TTWC. That's TTWC. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we've put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.